Hello and welcome to this February 2020 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name is George Miller, and my guest in this edition of the programme is writer and journalist Maxime Lancien, who has written an article entitled Australia's Angry Summers in the February edition of the paper. We've seen the infernal images in recent weeks. Australia is burning. Maxime's article explores the context of this environmental disaster and others that Australia is experiencing, major loss of wildlife and habitats, and the degradation of the Great Barrier Reef. Unbearably hot summers, rampant bushfires, and rising sea levels may be becoming Australia's new normal. And yet, as Maxime told me in this interview, the mining industry runs the country. Australia is the world's biggest coal exporter, and Indian conglomerate Adani plans to open the world's biggest coal mine in Queensland, covering an area 4 times the size of Paris. I wanted to know when I spoke to Maxime if he thought this, Australia's angriest summer, would be a turning point in Australia's climate wars. But first, I asked him what exactly an angry summer is.
They're talking about drought, bushfires, heat waves that last for days, and temperatures that are hard to bear because it's 35 degrees each day, sometimes 40 degrees. So you just stay home or you go shopping, but you stay indoors. I felt like you don't want to go outside. The angry summer means that there is no pleasure being in summer and going to the beach or just outside to have a stroll. You just feel lazy. You have no rest from the sun. If you live in the cities, it's okay because you have many places to go to, cinema, shopping malls, and etc. But if you live in the countryside, as some people do, few but still, you experience drought and you have cattle that die, you have rivers that run dry, and you feel dust storms, you feel strong storms too. So the way where you live, it depends what you can feel, but angry summer is it's violent.
I think you say in your article, fire has always been part of the Australian landscape. It's shaped the landscape in a sense, but it has become a much bigger problem since the summers became angrier.
Yes. That's a question people I've been talking about a lot about these bushfires in Australia, and yes, Aboriginal people did manage the landscape through fire, and that's a knowledge that did not lost, but because of the modern history of Australia, this management of landscapes through fire has been lost. And now what we are witnessing is that the whole country is burning. And my point in the article, and that's why I've interviewed Anne Paulina, an Aboriginal woman from the Kimberley, tries to reconnect the traditional knowledge of the Aboriginal to the modern knowledge of the science, of the Western science, we could say. It's a way to share the knowledge of the traditional owners of the land. And but for sure, bushfires were common in Australia. Now it's been more than maybe 10 years that there is something completely out of control everywhere in Australia, because yes, there is a sense of not caring for the land, maybe.
One way of not caring for the land is to extract coal from it. A large part of your article is about mining and the extractive industries in Australia. It might surprise people that Australia is the biggest exporter of coal in the world.
Yes.
So what is it important to know about the Australian mining industry in this context?
What we must understand about Australia is how the lobby group influence the Australian policies about energy and undermine the Australian democracy. So the coal lobby makes Australian democracy. And the mining industry makes jobs. Jobs matter to people, and maybe more that environment. But the thing is that industry pays well in Western Australia, Queensland, everywhere where you have this mining industry, very powerful. You have jobs and the wages are very, very interesting. It's a way of life. And yeah, the lobby group says that coal is the future of Australia and it gives jobs to people. So it's hard to talk about coal without talking about jobs.
But as you say in the article, the mining industry is going towards more automation. So there are sort of self-driving trucks, and a lot of there's no guarantee that even if mining continues, that it will mean a lot of well-paid jobs,
Yeah.
irrespective of the environmental impacts.
Yeah, I've talked about Rio Tinto, but it concerns other companies. But it's true that they are saying that they will offer thousands of jobs in region that needs employment for people. But when we look at where all the money goes, it goes to the automation. So we can talk about, of course, corruption between the politician and the industrial lobby, but there are not so many jobs. There are some, of course. So we have to look properly at where all the money goes, especially when we look at the Queensland case with all these huge infrastructure for mining industries and huge consequences for environment in the Queensland desert or along the shore and the reef especially.
And it seems astonishing that Australia can be burning and at the same time thinking about opening the biggest new coal mine on Earth. So not simply continuing with existing mines, but actually opening a vast new mine at the same time as the country is experiencing this terrible extreme climate.
The mining industry gives wealth to the country, and there is this huge project of the Carmichael mine in Queensland. But I mean, there are people like struggling to fight these huge projects. But how many Australians feel concerned about it, it's hard to know. So even though every Australian experienced this angry summer, the majority of the people live in big cities. So these projects, they are very far away from their homes. And when you live in Perth or in Melbourne or Canberra, Queensland seems far away. You don't see these mines and you are not impacted directly by this project. So you hear about in the news, you can read about it in the newspaper, but it's not in your backyard. So, I mean, you don't see it, you don't feel concerned. So you are just living your life and going to the work and spending your money in the shopping malls. But since the mines are not close to the cities, you don't see them, so it's abstract.
But do you think things are beginning to change in Australia with this sequence of angrier summers, and also now this year with the bushfires? I mean, even if your own city is not burning, it's impossible to ignore that. I mean, there must be a sense that something very significant is happening.
There is a sense of the seriousness of the threat, but for now, from where I am now, I don't believe there will be a profound change unless there is a huge mobilization of the people to change the policy of the energy in Australia. But for what I've read and what's going on in Australia, I doubt that because there are too many lobby groups in Canberra. Of course, there will be a change because many people have been impacted and I've seen their houses burnt, and we talk about the loss of the wildlife and of these incredible forests like the Blue Mountains, but the mining industry runs the country, So I doubt that there will be a profound change about the coal industry or the extractive industry. I really doubt that there will be a change, because there have been like destruction of native landscapes everywhere in Australia. Like there is not a single state in Australia that has not been impacted by this colonial mindset. So from Perth to Sydney, there have been destruction. So I doubt that because of these bushfires, there will be a change and Australia will lead a better policy. If you look at the Paris Agreement, they're not showing the example. So I doubt that, especially with the prime minister that you have at the moment, Scott Morrison, who before this angry summer was not on the lead to fight the climate change.
You went to see the writer Tim Winton. I thought the conversation you had with him sounded very interesting, because he's talking about, I guess, the sort of history of mainly white English settlers in Australia, and how their attitude to the landscape, a sort of hostility to the landscape, has shaped ideas that are perhaps still present, maybe beginning to change. But can you say something about what his ideas were about Australians and the land?
Well, Tim Winton is a writer that I really like, and he's from Perth, from Fremantle, and I've been lucky to meet him because he moves a lot, and he wrote a book named Island Home, which I really like because it's like an essay, a personal essay, and an autobiography too. And it tells the chapter of his life through the landscape. It's a book about the love for Australia he feels. His point is, yes, the way the settlers felt and understood Australia. And he describes it very well when he talks about the names the settlers gave to some places like Lake Disappointment. And this Terra Australia was an horrible place. It's about the beauty of landscape. And it's when the settlers came, beauty means lush, green, and they were coming from Britain, and they arrived in this huge island, a reed island, and they found the desert hell. So they despise the island. They've conquered Australia. They made it own, and they denied the right to the Aboriginal to live on this land. And there is many points to raise in his book about the meaning of landscape, the meaning of beauty, and the meaning to seeing the landscape. And he talks about in this book, Island Home, about what does mean seeing the landscape. And it's been 200 years, he's saying, that the mindset about seeing this landscape as empty or not a place for human, and the only place where people can live would be the shores of the country, because you have wind and the sea, and it's not too hot. But it said the land has been managed by people for thousands of years, 46,000 years at the minimum. So it says that they did arrive and say, okay, this is terrible, but we'll make it home. And that will be a huge jail. And he said this is why there is a strong need to reconnect the people to this island and to make it home. In my article, I wanted to write about the meaning of country and territory. And he says when you look at the name Northern Territory, it sounds very colonial. Northern Territory means nothing, and it says there is no poetry in the name, and it denies the right of the true Aboriginal names for this place. And the country means a relationship between the land and the people, and there is a shift according to Tim Winton, because in between his generation and the generation of younger people, saying that the settlers made a relationship where the people parent the land, And now the people feel more like the child of the land.
You quote a bumper sticker that you saw in Queensland, which basically says, leave my cold job alone,
Yes,
and I'll leave your soy latte
yes,
alone. I
yes.
mean, does that, although it's just a bumper sticker, does that sort of show the polarity, the division, the two sides in this war, would you say, in Australia at the moment? And how loud is the voice of the environmental side? Is it drowned out, or is it growing in importance?
Well, this quote about the soy latte is it's the same in USA, like the caricature of the greenies against the people who want jobs and industry to work well. Queensland has a racist history. Joe Bjelke-Petersen, he was the prime minister of Queensland, and he has a a terrible policy towards the Aboriginal people. And during the Cold War, the Queensland was like freaking out against the communists. So there is a specific mindset in Queensland. It's a conservative state. Queensland has a lot in common with the conservative in the US. So what I mean is this ad you can find in the streets of Queensland, you can have the same in the US. So you can say to environmental people, you are a greenie, you are a greenie. There is contempt for the greenies, as they would say. So I don't know. I mean, the people I've met, they feel concerned about the future for themselves and their children, but you don't hear much about environmental issues. Depends on what kind of shows you look on TV and medias, but I feel that this is still the Rupert Murdoch system that runs Australia, and the conservative voice is very, very strong. And so I doubt that journalists can do well their work, because, yes, there is people that we should listen more, to begin with Aboriginal people, scientists or writers like Richard Flanagan or Tim Winton, that you don't hear unless you follow their what they say on Facebook, or you follow ONG like Ningaloo Reef Alliance or other kind of NGOs like this. But I mean, when you watch the Australian TV, it's like, like watching sometimes Fox News. You don't hear much about climate policy.
I was listening to a radio interview about the bushfires, and the interview was saying there's a lot of discussion about arson, about saying these fires are started deliberately.
Yeah.
And you can see how that kind of idea might make people think, well, it's not about climate change. We don't have to do anything. It's simply about a few bad
Arsonist.
people starting.
Yeah.
People, outside Australia might be thinking, well, what's happening is terrible, but perhaps it will make the rich developed world really take notice. If a rich developed country like Australia is suffering like this, maybe good things will come of a bad situation. But then you hear something like, it's blamed on arson, or I've heard it blamed on green policies because the brush is not being
Yes.
burned regularly enough. So all sorts of ways of undermining what might actually turn into positive, serious action. And so I guess my question is, for people who are looking at Australia and thinking, well, maybe there is some good which can come of it, is that too optimistic?
It's a bit too optimistic. There is another piece I wanted to talk about and share with you. It's a quarterly that I like, and that I read a lot. It's Mianjin. Maybe you know it. Mianjin Quarterly. And there was a piece written by Clive Hamilton in November 2017. And his article is about climate denying in Australia. And the title of his article was Love in a Hot Climate, the Horrible Mess of Climate Change Politics. And when you read as the Clive Hamilton article, you read about the history of climate denying in Australia. And as I've already said, it's the same story in USA. It's been like 20 years that people hear about that climate change is a lie. and they read it in books, in TV shows and newspaper. So I mean, it's the propaganda. It hasn't stopped. It was already there like in the 20 years ago, and it still goes on. So yes, and you have these kind of private institutes who try to influence the more deputies they can. For me, like when you read at the Australian situation, there are so much in common with USA. So yeah, I'm not too optimistic.
Well, so as not to end on too pessimistic a note, tell us a book that you think it's worth reading to get an idea. Is it by Tim Winton? Would that be your top recommendation for someone who wants to read and reflect a little bit more about the Australian situation and relationship with landscape?
Well, reading Tim Winton is yes, that would be my reading advice is to read Island Home by Tim Winton. It's beautiful and very personal, and a very good starting point to understand Australia. And there is another good book that I've read for my article, is written by David Ritter. It's called The Cold Truth: The Fight to Stop Adani, Defeat the Big Polluters and Reclaim Our Democracy. That's also another excellent book to understand the coal industry and its future in Australia. Reading David Ritter, The Cold Truth, you understand a lot about how coal rules Australia and how coal makes modern Australia too.
I was talking to Maxime Lancien about his article, Australia's Angry Summers, which is in the February 2020 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's also available on the website at mondediplo.com. Maxime's reading recommendations again were Island Home, a landscape memoir by Tim Winton, published by Penguin Australia, Picador in the UK and Milkweed Editions in the US, and David Ritter's The Coal Truth, The Fight to Stop Adani, Defeat the Big Polluters and Reclaim Our Democracy, which is available from the University of Western Australia Publishing. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of Le Monde Diplomatique, going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources, such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.